Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week we're going to be talking about identity theory. Okay, so our reading for this week is from JCC Smart, Sensations and Brain Processes. I also encourage you to read this article about PHINEAS GAGE, right? We'll hear more on that soon. Okay, so the mind and the brain. Last time we saw Armstrong arguing for this view in which the mind just is identical with the brain. He thought that that was probably the best view because it was the most scientifically informed view, right? For Armstrong, any theory of the mind needed to be one that was acceptable by science. And science at the time seemed to suggest that, well, all things are physical. Therefore, any kind of theory of the mind ought to be one in which the mind is going to have some kind of physical explanation. That leads him first to behaviorism, but then to the brain, right? Ultimately, accepting that the brain just is the mind, or rather, the mind just is the brain. Okay. That line of thinking we saw goes against these common intuitions that we've been seeing so far throughout the semester, right? With Nagel, with Descartes, it seems to go against this notion that some quality of the mind seems uncapturable by a purely physical analysis, right? There are some things to experience, for example, if we're talking Nagel specifically, that cannot be captured by mere physical explanation. But we're going to see today that there are some other intuitions that might steer us away from views like Nagel's and Descartes, etc. Right? There might be other intuitions that do encourage the kind of theory that Armstrong had in mind. Okay, so to get there, the dualist seems to already note that there has to be some kind of relationship between the body and the mind, right? When the body physically interacts with things, sometimes it happens that the mind is thusly affected. So for example, when I, with my body, stub my toe, well, it seems like there is some effect on my mind, on my experience, right? I feel pain. So it seems like the dualist already has to admit, in some way or other, the mind and the body are intimately linked. At least they're able to impact one another. They're able to interact, right? Well, what Smart is going to suggest is that that connection is actually much stronger. It's not just that it's capable of interacting with one or the other, it's that there's a relationship of identity. Okay, so how do we get to this further intuition? How do we get to the deeper intuition from acknowledging that, yes, the mind and the brain have to interact to some degree, to they're actually just one and the same? Well, here's where we talk about PHINEAS GAGE, right? So PHINEAS GAGE was a railroad worker who sustained a fairly traumatic brain injury, right? So he was responsible for driving in these charges into stone. So he would, drill a hole, put a charge like a dynamite, and then using this huge steel rod, pack with sand the dynamite down into the hole, right? Well, on one occasion, him striking the steel pole caused sparks, which ignited the charge, and the bar went straight through his cheek and out of his skull, right? So this iron rod went through his brain, damaging a large portion of his left frontal lobe, right? He survived, which makes this case interesting, right? He survived, but the people who knew him started to report that he was behaving very strangely, that his personality seemed to be changed, right? He was once seen as like a quiet, sort of respectful person. Now he seems to be aggressive and mean-spirited, right? So neuroscientists like studying PHINEAS GAGE and the other cases like this. There are many. Some people lose entire hemispheres and still go on living, right? So they're fascinated for neurological reasons, of course. But philosophers of mind are interested in these cases because it seems to suggest it's not just that the body has some ability to interact with the mind, but in some way the mind seems to be constituted by the body, right? It's damage to Gage's brain that produces changes in his personality, right? Changes to his mind. It seems like altering a part of his brain caused a direct alteration into who he is, into his mind directly. So the new intuition that we get out of this kind of thing is that the mind and the brain are much more deeply related than the dualist would like us to think, right? In fact, it might be the case that the mind just is the brain. That is ultimately going to be what Smart is going to argue, right? So Smart is going to argue for what we call identity theory. Okay? Identity theory is just the idea that the mind is identical with the brain. So it is identical with the brain, right? Identity theory. Okay, so he's going to do this by first challenging the dualist notion, their intuition, right? But then he is going to kind of build his own case towards the end of the paper. Okay. So everything else, Smart argues, we understand in purely physical terms, right? Think about any other phenomena that you might be interested in. Smart says at this point, we have accepted that we can give them all physical explanations. It's only one's like phenomenal experience, one's sensations, that's what Smart is going to continue to use throughout this piece, are sensations that seem to resist this kind of explanation. And that, Smart thinks, is very odd, right? It would be very odd if we were to say that, well, everything in the universe can be explained this way, except for this one thing, which has to have its own rules, right? He refers to this kind of thing as a nomological dangler, right? That might not make much sense to you, but nomological just means something that's law-like, right? So a nomological dangler then is Smart's way of saying, yeah, there's this thing that's just hanging out all by itself, functioning according to its own little laws that don't touch on anything else, right? So we have one set of laws describing everything, and then one little hanger-on that describes just one very specific thing, right? So Smart thinks that's sort of ridiculous, that you can't accept a view like that. Okay. Let's see. His own view then. Sensations just are a kind of brain process, right? This is identity theory. The sensations, the things that Nagel was talking about, that taste of chocolate, right? That just is a brain process. Nothing more. Identity theory. But he wants to be pretty careful here, right? There are some ways of misunderstanding him. He wants to make sure we avoid those. First, he wants to say that just because sensations are a kind of brain process, it does not follow that the kinds of things we say about sensations are going to be about brain processes, right? So when I say, for example, I'm Nagel, right? And I'm saying, I'm tasting chocolate right now. I'm tasting chocolate right now. It doesn't follow that what I mean when I say that is that I'm having a kind of brain process, right? No, I mean something different when I say that I'm tasting chocolate right now. But that doesn't mean the two things aren't identical, right? In the same way, when I see a bit of light flash in the sky on a rainy day, and I say, I'm seeing lightning right now, right? I don't have to be thinking that lightning involves this electrical discharge due to ionization or something like that. I don't have to have that in mind, right? I can be thinking something totally different. So even though the two things are identical, as lightning and electrical discharge are, we don't have to think of them that way. Nevertheless, the identity holds, right? The factual nature just is that lightning is electrical discharge. And so for Smart, even though we don't think of our sensations as brain processes, and therefore our expressions that we use to talk about them do not mean the same thing as statements about brain processes mean, it's nevertheless the case that it's a matter of fact that they're identical, right? Okay. So I can talk in terms of two different senses, right? How it appears and then how it really is, right? Second, they don't even have to, these two ways of talking don't have to abide by what he calls the same logic, right? So there might be rules that we have governing what's okay to say when we're talking about sensations that aren't okay to say when we're talking about brain processes. So for example, when we talk about sensations, it seems like I don't get to tell you what kind of sensation you're having, right? We both take a bite out of a chocolate bar. I say, oh yeah, I taste like a very sweet, chocolatey flavor, right? And you say, no, this is very bitter. I taste very bitter chocolate. Okay, well, by the rules, by the logic of talking about sensations, it seems like it would be inappropriate for me to say, no, you don't, right? You don't taste it that way, right? You know, I don't. That's part of it being a sensation. But when we talk about brain states, it seems like it now is appropriate for us to say one way or the other, right? Why? Because these things are third person objective, right? We can look at them and tell. Right. Okay, so it seems like there might be different rules for how we talk about these different things. Smart argues still that doesn't mean that they are not identical, right? We might have different rules for talking, but that doesn't mean that the two things are not identical. I might have certain rules for talking about how lightning behaves, right? And different rules for talking about electricity. That doesn't mean that lightning is not electricity. Right? It just means we have additional ways of talking. Okay, so before really giving us his own argument for the view, identity theory, Smart is going to go through quite a few objections. He talks about 8 of them. We're only going to cover 7 because the 8th has to do with philosophy of language. We don't really need to get into it. How he addresses these views is going to show you really what he's thinking here when he says that a sensation just is a kind of brain process. Okay, so first objection then. The first objection is that there has to be a difference between brain processes and sensation, like a taste of chocolate, right? Because we talk about the taste of chocolate and other sensations all the time, even though most of us don't know anything about brain processes. So if the two were the same, the idea goes, it would not be possible for us to know quite a lot about sensations and nothing about brain processes. How is it that I'm a capable speaker about my sensations, but I know next to nothing about brain processes? If they're identical, doesn't that seem strange? Smart's reply is fairly simple. He wants to say that you can know a thing in different ways. You can know the same thing in different ways. So for example, I can talk about lightning, I can recognize lightning, I can say many different things about lightning and not know anything about electricity. That doesn't mean that lightning is not electricity, right? So philosophers make this kind of distinction all the time, right? Typically, philosophers of language like using Superman as an example here, right? So Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. They just are the same person. Clark Kent is Superman's alter ego. Okay. Most people, because Superman tries to remain private, do not know that Clark Kent is Superman. Most people don't know that. Because of that, it's possible for someone to believe that Superman can fly without believing that Clark Kent can fly. Why would they believe that Clark Kent can fly? He's just some regular guy, right? How is this possible? Well, because they're not aware that the two are identical. They're not aware that the two are identical. Does that mean that the two are not identical? No, it doesn't, right? So just because I can talk a lot about my sensations and say all kinds of things about them and not be able to talk very much about my brain processes, that does not mean that they are not the same thing, right? We could know a lot about our sensations and nothing about our brain processes, even though they might be identical. So this first objection doesn't really seem to work. Objection 2. The co-occurrence of a sensation and a brain state seems entirely contingent. Okay, so co-occurrence meaning they're occurring at the same time, right? So when I'm having a certain kind of experience or sensation, there's also a certain kind of brain state happening right at the same time. The thought here is that that could be contingent. Contingent meaning it could have been otherwise. It could have been some other brain state. Maybe a brain state didn't have to occur at all. There's no obvious necessary connection between the two. And if that is so, then we do not have enough to establish identity between sensations and brain states, and thus we should not think that reporting of a sensation like I'm tasting chocolate right now is in any way a report of a brain process. Okay, so Smart's reply is to just re-emphasize one of the qualifications he made earlier when he was trying to avoid misunderstandings. Just because two things are identical, he says, it does not follow that we have to talk about them in the same way. It does not follow that they operate by the same logic of talking, right? When I make a claim about tasting chocolate, I do not mean to say something like, I am having a brain process now. But again, that does not mean that it's not in fact the case, right? So just because I mean something different when I say I'm having the taste of chocolate, I'm experiencing the taste of chocolate right now, then I'm having a brain process now, it does not follow that the two things are not identical, right? Okay. Moving on, objection 3. The third objection, which Smart spends most of the time talking about, I'd say at least relative to all the other objections, he spends quite a few pages here, is that while Smart might have been successful in showing that these experiences cannot be extra physical properties, like in a sort of Cartesian substance way, they might still be psychical properties of physical things. So think back to our first assigned reading on Nagel, right? Nagel, at the end of the day, wanted to say, no, look, your mental experiences are coming from the brain. They are related to the brain. In fact, they are brain states. But his move was to say, and brain states have psychical properties to them. In fact, everything does, right? Remember, he has that dual aspect view. So this is the kind of objection being made now. Like, okay, sure, maybe experiences, sensations really are the brain. It's still possible that there's some extra beyond the physical properties of that thing, of the brain, right? Okay, so again, that's Nagel's view. Smart's reply is pretty complicated. For our purposes, we only need to think of it in this way. He wants to say something like, that special experiential quality of sensation that Nagel is arguing can't be captured by any kind of physical analysis, that taste of chocolate, is perhaps less contentful than we think it is. He wants to say something like, when you're having an experience, so you tasted chocolate or you're seeing the color orange is what he's using, you see a flash of orange light. What's really happening, or what you're really saying when you say, I saw a flash of orange light, is something like this. There is something going on which is like what is going on when I really see an orange. In other words, he's taking the content of the experience out, and it's just a report of experience now, right? I had an experience like I have when I taste chocolate or other sweet things, right? There is no content there anymore, right? So when we report our experiences, then we're just comparing some stimuli to others. The experience of this, like tasting the chocolate bar, is like this, but not like that. When we do that, you don't have to have real, robust content to the experience anymore. There is nothing that it's like to taste a chocolate bar. It's just like this or like that, right? If you go with that view, you don't need to have this idea of special properties of experience. Why? Because you lose that content. You lose that content. Okay, so Smart isn't sure whether this works, right? This is his best kind of stab at it for the moment, but he's not sure if it works, and so he admits that objection 3 is a pretty strong contender. Now, just because he fails to utterly crush this objection does not mean that his view here fails. In fact, when he gives us, ultimately, in the last couple pages, his own argument for his view, we see that his responses to these objections, they don't really matter in the end. These objections are more or less him trying to defend the notion that seeing the mind as nothing but a brain process is like a coherent intuition, right? Okay. Objection 4. So this fourth objection should also seem fairly similar. The idea is that since the taste of chocolate or any kind of experiential content is not in physical space, it cannot be a brain process, right? So again, this is like Descartes, right? The mind is supposed to be undivided in a certain respect. It's not in physical space. Brain processes are necessarily in physical space, therefore cannot be the same thing, right? Okay, so Smart makes it clear, again here, after using this last move on objection 3, there's a difference between the experience of the taste of chocolate and the taste of chocolate, right? So it's the experience that Smart is saying is a brain process. What's identical to a state of the brain? The experience of the tasting of chocolate. The taste of chocolate itself is either out there in the world or it's not a real thing under Smart's view, right? It's either out there in the world or it's not a real thing. So there's an experience of tasting chocolate that can be found in the brain. Thus, it should be no surprise that we cannot find the taste itself within the brain. We're not looking for that, right? So here's a quote. Trees and wallpaper can be green, but not the experience of seeing or imagining a tree or wallpaper. Okay, so you have someone like Nagel or Descartes saying, well, when I have an experience of a tree, there is this greenness to my experience. And that greenness cannot be found if you were to open up my brain and look for it. Smart is now saying, no, you have an experience of the tree. That's it, right? The greenness is out there. It's not in you. It's not a quality of your experience. The greenness is in the tree. It's not in you. It's not a quality of your experience. And therefore, there is nothing about your experience that cannot be seen, right? That cannot be seen by physical examination. So he is more or less denying that there is this kind of robust quality to our experiences, this notion of raw feels or qualia, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. He's denying that those things actually inhere in us. They're not qualities of our experiences. They're qualities of the things we are experiencing, or they're not there at all, right? Okay. Whether or not that works, maybe we'll get a better idea when we start covering qualia in the second half of the semester. Fifth objection. This idea is that there's ways of talking about brain processes that do not seem appropriate when applied to sensation. So here's a quote. It would make sense to say of a molecular movement in the brain that it is swift or slow, straight or circular, but it makes no sense to say this of the experience of seeing something yellow. So again, he wants to remind us that his notion of identity does not mean we have to mean the same things when talking about the same different phenomena. We can talk in multiple different ways about the same phenomena. So when talking about a sensation, I may not mean to say something about the brain at all. And when talking about the brain, I may not mean to say anything about sensation. But that doesn't mean that they are not identical. Okay, so at this point, he talks about the evening star and the morning star quite a lot, right? This has a privileged place in the history of analytic philosophy, which is the kind of philosophy we're doing right now. So let me kind of explain what this example is supposed to do. The evening star is supposed to be the first star that appears in the night sky. The morning star is supposed to be the last star that fades with the day, with the coming day, right? It turns out that they are one and the same star, right? They're one and the same star. In fact, they're not a star at all. They're the planet Venus, right? So Venus is the evening star and Venus is the morning star, okay? Well, when I'm talking about the evening star, I might say some things that would not be appropriate to say about the morning star. That doesn't mean that the two things are not identical. In exactly the same way that when I'm talking about a sensation or when I'm talking about a brain process, it might not be appropriate to say that same thing about the other class. Like if I'm talking about the brain and I say, oh yeah, I can imagine the brain moving swiftly or slowly, whatever. It might seem inappropriate to say that I can say the same things in my sensations. But that doesn't mean that the two are not the same. In the same way that when I say, the evening star is the first star to appear in the evening, right? It's not appropriate to say, well, the morning star is the first star to appear in the evening, right? It goes against the kind of logic, the kind of rules of the talking about the two different things. That doesn't mean the evening star is not the morning star, right? Okay. So the same idea applies to sensations and brain processes. Objection 6. The sixth objection has to do with this seemingly personal nature of experience, right? When I'm having an experience of like the taste of chocolate, to continue using Nagel's example, right? It doesn't seem like I can share my experience with you. It doesn't seem like anyone can look inside my brain or inside my head and see the experience, right? It doesn't seem accessible to other people. But the opposite seems to be true for brain processes, right? At least with the right equipment, it seems at least hypothetically possible that we could all see one another's brain processes. Okay. Additionally, most importantly, it seems like I can't be wrong about my own experiences, right? No, I'm tasting chocolate now. I don't need anyone to verify that for me. I can tell, right? For sure, I'm tasting chocolate right now. But when we go to assess what brain states are going on, there's all kinds of room for error. So Smart is going to use the same old move, right? He's going to say, listen, the way in which we use language to talk about these things does not mean that identity is not possible, right? We might use a certain kind of language to talk about one. We might refer to it as a personal kind of thing and refer to the other as an objective kind of thing. It does not mean that they are not identical, right? Okay, so in effect, he wants to argue that it's really just a rule of language that we've adopted that a person really knows their experience. They know their experience directly and with clarity. He wants to say that's just a kind of way we have of talking. And he doesn't spend much more time discussing that. I think there's a lot more room for him to reply to this objection than he uses. For example, there's all kinds of challenges to the notion that we know our own minds well, right? We saw some of that last class, right? Okay, let's move on to the last objection that we're going to consider. Objection 7. Quote, I can imagine myself turned to stone and yet having images, aches, pains, and so on. In other words, I can imagine the mind being distinct from the body, right? I can imagine the body being destroyed and the mind continuing. Again, very Cartesian, right? Smart's reply is this. Well, I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false. I can imagine that lightning is not an electrical discharge, but it is. So the idea then is that, look, just because you can imagine or you can conceive of the two being separate, it does not follow that they are, right? It doesn't follow from the mere fact that you can imagine them being non-identical that they are not identical. This might seem like he's arguing against a straw man, right? Someone who no one would ever say this kind of argument, right? That's not necessarily the case. We're going to see conceivability arguments when we get to consciousness. So keep this in mind for later in the semester when we start talking about consciousness. Okay. So ultimately, Smart thinks objection 7 is just coming out of this kind of Cartesian-like dualist hypothesis that sensations and other mind stuff are somehow more than mere physical things. So Smart wants to give a bit of a concession here. A bit, right? He wants to say, look, that's a hypothesis. Not only is it a hypothesis, but it's intelligible. I know what you mean when you say that. But there's a competing hypothesis. And that competing hypothesis is that sensations and mind stuff just are brain processes. In these two theories, they both account for the evidence, right? So we can't simply assert a priori, is what he says, that one is true, right? We cannot, without looking into the matter, that's what rejecting the notion of a priori decision is. Without looking into the matter, we can't simply say the dualist hypothesis wins, right? We've got to do a little bit of work. So what makes a good hypothesis then? How are we going to decide if both of these hypotheses are intelligible and both of them account for the evidence? How are we going to decide which one to go for? Well, the issue isn't empirical, right? A lot of the time when you have this problem where you say, well, I have two competing hypotheses, the way you resolve it is by collecting evidence, right? That's what we mean in philosophy when we say that the matter is empirical. I mean, it can be solved by just collecting more evidence, by using experience, right? Smart wants to say this is not that kind of issue, right? It would be if what were in competition with the mind-brain identity theory was something like heart-brain identity theory, right? We could run a bunch of experiments to see whether or not the brain or the heart seemed more related to what we typically refer to as mind, right? We could do a bunch of experiments. This would be an empirical matter. But the dualist hypothesis, Smart claims, is epiphenomenal, right? Epiphenomenal is a word we're going to see again. It just means that it doesn't have to do with physical causes, right? So if you say that a thing is epiphenomenal, you mean that it has no physical effects, right? It doesn't have the ability to touch physical things, to have causal effect on the physical. So if the dualist hypothesis is epiphenomenal, it means that there's not going to be a way for us to test it, right? Because in order to test it, we need to be able to see its effects, right, on the physical world, the world we can experience. So we can't settle the matter empirically. Okay, we can't settle the matter empirically. Smart argues that the dualist hypothesis, since it's not an empirical hypothesis, can be sort of an analogy can be made between it and this other hypothesis of the young Earth creationists, right? So young Earth creationists believe that the Earth was created exactly as it is now, maybe 6,000 or so years ago, right? Exactly as it was described in the biblical book of Genesis. That's young Earth creationism. So the young Earth creationist hypothesis accounts for all of the available evidence, right? We look at all of the sediment and rivers, all of the fossils and rocks, all of the eroded cliffs, its canyons, etc. We can explain all of those things, right, through young Earth creationism. How? Well, God put them there specifically. The way they are now is the way they were placed there with intention. They were not the result of some long natural process over time, right? They were placed there with intention. Okay, well, if this kind of hypothesis accounts for everything, right? It has an explanation for everything. Why is this fossil here in this particular kind of rock? Oh, well, because God placed it there specifically. Oh, okay. They can account for everything. What's wrong with that hypothesis if it can do that? Well, the problem for Smart is that it accounts for all of these individual facts, like why is this fossil here? Why is that fossil there? Why is this fossil there? By just stating that they are so, right? There's no means by which I can say all of these things are explained through one other kind of explanation. I can't give you a kind of general theory that from that theory allows you to explain the things around you. Instead, I have to give you individual facts to explain each little thing, right? Why is that fossil in that particular place relative to all the other sediment, etc.? Oh, Well, because God specifically put that fossil right there, right? Whereas if I have these other views about natural processes, I can tell you in a way that's going to explain other similar phenomena too, right? So, quote, no explanation in terms of the evolution of pterodactyls from earlier life forms of life would any longer be possible, right? The idea that why pterodactyls are the way they are, right? Well, no, there's not a thing, right? Pterodactyls are the way they are because God made them that way and placed them in a certain place, not because of some natural process that I can tell you about that's going to allow you to explain many other things, right? So a consequence of this kind of view is that we can't rely on a few facts to explain all these other small facts, right? We'll need an individual fact for every single thing we want to explain. Quote, we would have millions of facts about the world as it was in 4004 BC that just have to be accepted. They just have to be accepted. If I accept instead these other more general facts that allow me to sort of draw conclusions from them, these things I can show you that they derive from these other facts, right? We can have discussions about this. But in this other kind of view, it seems like because it's non-empirical, we just have to accept that they are the case. Okay, so the conclusion here, what Smart is driving at, is that we should opt for views that are more parsimonious, right? Parsimonious is a label that philosophers apply to certain kinds of theories. Specifically, they're theories that are simpler, right? They're simpler. They account for the same stuff. They offer explanations for the same things, but with fewer tools to do so, right? Okay, so should we accept a view that requires us to accept many, many different facts in order to account for the same evidence, or should we accept a view that only requires a few facts to account for the same evidence? If you think parsimony matters, you're going to prefer the theory that has fewer tools going in, right? Fewer tools going in. You might have heard of this kind of thing called Occam's razor, right? Always go with the simpler view, right? So why do we reject something like the young earth creationist view? Because they have to have individual facts for every little thing, right? That's vastly complicated. And we just kind of have to accept that those are the facts. Whereas a view that says, no, these fossils are here because of various natural processes. Okay, well, now you've given me one fact to explain many, many other things, right? It's far more parsimonious. That's why we reject that view, right? Well, Smart wants to say the same thing occurs with the dualist, right? The dualist hypothesis is intelligible. Just like the young earth creationists, we understand the claims that they're making, and they do account for all of the evidence, right? If the dualist is right, we can make sense of the mind and to some extent the body, right? They account for all the evidence. But it's not as parsimonious as the mind-brain identity theory. Why? Well, because the mind-brain identity theory just says we have the physical laws. We have the physical laws that the scientists have been talking about, and that's really all there is, because the mind is reducible to the body, right? Specifically the brain. The dualist has to have those nomological danglers, right? They say, no. There are those physical laws, sure, but there's also these special laws that explain just these particular facts and nothing more, right? So can you see now Smart is arguing that is not parsimonious. My view is more parsimonious than that, and therefore if you accept that parsimony is a virtue of any good theory, then you should accept mind-brain identity theory over any kind of Cartesian substance dualism, right? So if we care about parsimony, we should be identity theorists. Okay, so there are going to end up being problems, as I am sure you have expected, for the identity theorist. We're going to get into those next time, right, with the emergence of functionalism. So look forward to that. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.